Hi, welcome to our video series called Music Notation Tenets. This series of videos is actually done to support and to teach music notation tenets or principles. It's also done in conjunction with a course that I teach at Maryville University. My name is Professor Scott Lyle. It furthermore supports a book that I wrote and published a couple of years ago, 2016, called An Introduction to the Conventions of Contemporary Music Notation, a 21st Century Vantage, and you can find this on Amazon. There will be a link at the bottom of the video in case you want to pursue this a little bit further. And this video series is going to support or back up the different chapters that are involved in my book. So it's a supplement, if you will. One doesn't have to purchase the book, of course, to understand these principles or to go a bit deeper, but I would strongly encourage you to pick up a copy because I compiled a considerable amount of information that's very difficult to find otherwise. And frequently this is circumvented or just skimmed over when people learn about music notation. Many people think they understand most of these principles, but in fact they only have a perfunctory understanding, very limited understanding of many of these things. So hopefully this series will help to bring more knowledge to the general public or anyone who's seriously interested. Okay, in the first chapter, what I talk about, and the first chapter is just literally called Notes, I assume that you understand that this is a whole note, this is a half note, this is a quarter note, dotted eighth note, quarter note rest, whole note rest, etc., etc. So I'm going to just assume that that's the case, and that you have an understanding that these are clefs, treble clef in particular, and so forth. As we go on to further and further chapters, we'll get a bit deeper with different concepts. So if you don't understand all of the clefs terribly well, we'll deal with that later. But for now, I'm going to assume that you can essentially read treble clef notes, bass clef notes. What I want to talk about first is putting stems on notes. Some notes don't feature stems, so it's not an issue at all, but many do, and we need to know how to draw them, how long they are, and what their general understanding is. Most stems in single voice writing, so not two notes going on simultaneously or two voices going on simultaneously, but single melodic lines are going to feature stems that go when they go down, they're going to go on the left side of the note. When they go up, they go on the right side of the note. They're typically 1 octave in length. So this is an E up here. Since the note is above the center line, the stem is going to go down. If the note head is below the center line, the note head will typically go up. And we'll get to a center line note in just a moment. So for all notes that have their note heads above the center line, the stems will go down. And they need to go down 1 octave. So this is an E. This line right here represents the next E. My line, my stem, needs to go down and touch that E line. This is another E. It's going to go up 1 octave, right to the center of that space, because that's where E is, so right on the center there. Just like this line hits the center of that note head. This is a C. Stem will go down. It's going to go down to approximately where middle C would be down here. This one's a G, stem will go up. Can't go up too far, that would be too much. Can't go up too little, too hard to tell what it is. Needs to go up an octave. G is approximately here. Maybe I overshot it just a little. And then this B is a center line note. I call this, in my book, I refer to it a lot as the center line default. Whenever a note's on the center line of any clef, really, if there's no other affecting influences on these notes, then the default is just to stem them down 1 octave. That's about a B. There's other reasons where the stem could go up, and maybe you learned in your early studies of music that the stem could go either direction. The stem can go either direction, but it needs an acting influence, some reason to stem it up, or sometimes a reason to stem it down, to not just honor the default. The default, if there's no reason to stem it one way or the other, the best practice is typically just to stem it down. But I'll take a look at a reason to stem it up in a moment with you. Here's some interesting things too. When notes go on to what we call Ledgerlines, notes that go beyond the staff, we don't just stem them 1 octave. That would be a G right here. This is a G going to the G line. Actually, that's not the common practice. The common practice is to take any note that goes beyond a B on either side. Anything lower the stem's going to go all the way up and connect to the center line. Anything higher is going to have a stem that connects again all the way down to the center line, regardless of how high it is. This is an E up here. I'm going to stem it all the way down to the center line. This is the common practice for this. You can ask a flute player. Their music is riddled with high notes like this with long stems connecting to the center line. This is a G up here, so it's not well beyond that octave. I'm going to stem it down to the next G. This one's a C. We would think we'd stem it down to where C is, but that's actually wrong. It's beyond an octave. It's beyond the B, which would stem down to the center line, and the B below, of course, would do the same. If we had a B below, it would stem all the way to the center line. Anything beyond those two notes is going to still stem to the center line. This E, far below the staff, is going to stem all the way to the center line. So we can see how that works. Stems going up are always on the right side of the note head. Stems going down are always on the left side of the note head. And they connect, preferably. So be careful when you're making some of your notes that you don't just, draw them out. That's pretty hard to recognize what that is. Doesn't make any sense. Furthermore, I like this one too. Quite wrong. For today's standards. You can see some evidence of that in some Baroque manuscripts, but that's not something we're covering today. So this is how stemming works in single voices. Okay, let's look at a couple possible scenarios where the center line notes may stem according to something that affects the stem placement. We've got two examples. One's in simple meter, 4/4 time. The other one's in compound meter. In 4/4 time, we typically have 4 beats per measure, and the quarter note's going to equal 1 beat. In 6/4 time, however, we typically have 2 beats per measure, compound meter, 2 beats per measure. More on this later if you're not certain about this concept. It can be divided a number of other ways depending on asymmetry or other contemporary practices, but the typical default is to have 2 beats per measure for compound meter, and in this case, in 6/4 time, the dotted half note is going to equal 1 beat. So the dotted half note is going to divide into 3 quarter note units. Beat 1, beat 2. Beat 1, beat 2. In 4/4 time, it's kind of an understanding that the measure is somewhat divided symmetrically. Simple meter typically divides, it likes to divide this way if at all possible. 3/4 could be an exception there. So looking at these two scenarios, which way do we stem these notes? Let's take a look. The typical idea is to default on centerline, default down. Always just default down. But there can be reasons to do otherwise. Let's see what some of these are. In this first instance, if we divide the measure in half, we see that the next note, beat 2 here, is an A. A needs to stem up because it's below, the note head is below the center line. We know that the same thing's happening with the F on beat 3. Well, since this is the case, and these two kind of share a unit of space in 4/4 time, rather than stemming this B down, we're going to stem it up. Because its next partner note here also stems up. Same case is true for beats 3 and 4. Since beat 3 stems up, we will stem beat 4 up. And if you look at that, that's a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. Most of these rules are designed so that one can read the music much more simply. These are grammar practices for music, for lack of a better description. At least that's a decent analogy. Let's take a look at it if I would have stemmed it wrong, incorrectly. It won't be terrible, but if you look at it, this is a little harder to read. It's a little less pleasing. It takes a little bit more concentration to identify the information that's there. So going back to what I said initially, missed that by a little bit. Guess I can fix that. It's music notation video. Now that's a little bit more pleasing. That makes a little more sense. Let's look at the case in measure 2 here. We know that the E has to stem down. The note's higher than the center line. On beat 3, we have to stem the G up. since again we're kind of looking at this from a symmetrical fashion here, dividing the measure in half, the B is the partner note of E, beat 2 here is the partner note of beat 1. I want to stem it down by default. Since its partner stems down, so does the B. On the other half of the measure, however, the G stems up. This would make a little more sense. So reading this, that should be a little bit easier to read. We could stem it down by default, but since the note right next to it is influencing it, affecting the reason that we would stem it up, this is the better choice. And it should be the better choice for you if you're reading, if you're sight reading. Let's take a look at 6/4 meter here. Remember, in 6/4 time, there's 2 beats per measure. Beat 1 comprises these 3 notes, these 3 quarter notes, because that's how a dotted half note divides. And beat 2 comprises these 3. Likewise, that's true here. I'm going to take away I'll leave the dots for now. First quarter note has to stem down. The note head is above the center line. Second one stems down. How far? 1 octave. That's approximately an F from the top F. So B wants to stem down by default. Can I do that? Absolutely. The other 2 do. Now these share a beat unit. It's a little bit more aesthetically pleasing, a little bit easier to read through. Had I stem that up, now we have a bit of an aberration, something that catches our eye, something a bit unusual. We don't want to do that. We want to try to avoid those things. This E must stem up an octave. I did that. The G stems up an octave. The B, I want to stem down by default, but I've got an acting influence. There's 2 notes that are sharing the same beat with it that both are stemmed up. So I'll stem this one up as well. And now we've got something a lot easier to read if you were sight reading this, or something like it. Obviously, most music you encounter is going to be a little bit more complex than what I'm making up for this video. But the tenets are still intact. They're still the same. Okay, let's follow through over here. I don't know what to do. I want to stem this down by default. Let's take a look at all the notes in my beat unit. I know that the C must stem down. I've got 2 other notes that I'm not sure about. I can do whatever I want. No, this one's going to influence both of them. Stem down, stem down. Now I've got something far easier to read. Let's look over here. Don't know what to do with these. I see 2 notes that need to stem up 1 octave each. So what do you think the B needs to do? I want to stem it down by default, but this time there's an acting influence. This is the best way to stem these 2 particular examples. If we were in a different meter, the same thing would be true too, but that deals with beaming. I think I'll save that for another conversation. Right, now it's time to stack some harmonic structures. Treble clef, bass clef. Put them both in 4/4 time. Not that anyone would ever want to play anything like that. Some of these get a bit extreme, and I just want to use this extreme aspect to show you that this concept still works in every aspect. So there's basically 4 beats worth of quarter note harmonic structures, notes that are sounding at the same time. They're ranging from dyads, 2-note groups, to triads, 3-note groups, to things much larger, tetrachord, pentachord, etc., etc. But we'll talk about stemming each of these, and the same rules that we discussed earlier are going to be brought into this aspect too. But one quick thing to note, when looking at these structures, the note furthest from the center line is what determines the stem direction. So that's true even in cases like this. I've seen students tell me things about this where they think the stem just naturally has to come from the bottom because look at how densely they are packed down here. You've got a lone D sitting way up on top down here, up here, and then a lone D at the bottom. But there's 4 notes all densely packed into this area, so we would think that a majority rules here that we should start stemming from the bottom up, but that's not necessarily true. So let's walk through each of these tenets. And sometimes notes are going to be equidistant from the center line. Then we have another dilemma, but it's still going to be that center line default rule, and I'll talk about that when we get there, or here. So looking at this first group here, we have a dyad, a 2-note group. We need to stem. Everything's pretty much aligned on top of each other the way they need to be, but we don't know if the stem goes down or up, or how far does it go. That's a bit tricky too, and the book will clarify that a bit better for you, but for these videos they're just merely supplementary. They're pretty helpful. So 2 notes, E on top, B on the bottom. Which one is furthest from the center line? Well, I have a note on the center line, but the E is furthest from the center line. So I'm going to stem, E governs which way the stem will go. E by itself would have a downward facing stem. So this unit will have a downward facing stem. How far do I go? Well, you're going to go an octave below the lowest note in the structure. Or if the stem's going up, the highest note in the structure. And I'll try to reinforce that as we go through here. So this is the way this should look. The stem should definitely not go up. It should go down because E is the furthest from the center, and it's going to go down an octave past the lowest note in our structure. Same kind of thing here. Which note is furthest from the center line? E is this far from the center line, a fifth below, but this C is a ninth above. This is pretty far away from the center line. C, regardless of the other notes, is going to determine the stem direction. C would be stemmed down. So we're going to take this one down. This one's a little tricky. We're not going to go exactly an octave below this. Once we come, if we're in a downward direction, if we're heading past the center line, anything lower than that's only going to continue down about a seventh in space. I guess keeping it from looking a bit odd. On this board, I think everything looks a little odd, but this is how you want to do this. Most music notation programs are going to do most of the things that I'm talking to you about. I typically use Finale. There are many, many programs around today available to you. Some of these tenets are not covered in these music notation programs. They don't honor 100% of these. They honor most of them. They don't honor all of them. So you having an understanding of this isn't just good for you as a musician, composer, writer, arranger, etc., but you may be correcting some errors in those notation programs. All of them feature some notation errors. Most of them are very good, but all of them feature some errors. So anyway, the stem's direction is right on this one. Next group right here, note furthest from the center line. Is it the E? Is it the G? G is much farther. G should stem up. We're going to continue upward. I'm going to go past this top E, approximately a seventh, and that's the way this stem should look. So over here, which one's furthest from the center line? F on the bottom, of course. This triad will stem up. I added some accidentals in, but these shouldn't be there to confuse you. They don't affect these stems at all by any means. So in these three notes right here, the B flat is furthest from the center line. B flat governs the stem direction, and it's going to look something like this. That's going to run into my big mess down here because this all belongs to the bass clef. So maybe I'll erase that one when I get there. I don't know. We can probably navigate around it. Pretend that's not there. Next group right here, the note furthest from the center line is this B down here. Stem connects all notes and heads up. Over here I've got two notes only in a dyad. This looks very strange because they're so far from the center line each. Which one is further? It's the A. They're close, but the A is further. A governs the stem direction, so that goes down. Much like that. Last one. Which one's furthest from the center line? This one has two ledger lines, the A. The A on top has only one. The A on the bottom governs the stem direction. They're all A's connecting in 3 octaves. It's probably a little bit long. We'll deal with that. Okay, bass clef over here. I've got C on the bottom, E on the top. They're both equidistant from the center line. What do? If there's no acting influence on them, like in the meter example, we stem these down. If there is something acting on them, something metric or otherwise, there could be a reason to stem them otherwise, but the default is just to stem them down. Same thing with this example right here, actually, if I go out of order. I've got a centerline note, and then two notes on the outsides that are equidistant with each other. Default is to stem them down. Picking up back here, which one's furthest from the center line? Oh, they're both a fourth from the center line. So the default is, yet again, to stem those down. Same thing here. Got a bunch of different notes. The whole thing's equidistant. It's a big mirror of itself. E on the top, C on the bottom. Makes no difference, really. So the centerline default is to stem down. That would be correct. 3 ledger lines each. A on the bottom, G on the top. The default is to stem them down. This one over here. 3 ledger lines again. did the same thing. It's getting a little redundant. Everything across the board, same way. So let's change this one. A little variety here. Doesn't matter that there's 3 notes down here in the basement. They're both equidistant. The default is to stem down. This one right here, the furthest note from the center line is now this G. Let's stem those up. Equidistant here, stem goes down. So we stack harmonic structures that don't include seconds. The next video will deal with seconds and then stemming intervals of seconds inside of harmonic structures.